Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. More former football players have waived their anonymity and gone public with emotional testimony of how they were sexually abused as teenagers. It brings to 7 the number of former players who say they were assaulted by football coaches when they were children. 2 gave harrowing accounts to the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire programme, as our sports correspondent Natalie Perks reports. And just a warning, you might find some of her report upsetting.
I thought, I've got to come forward. Got to come forward and help everybody.
Chris Unsworth had never told his story before, not to a single soul. But today he finally told the harrowing tale he'd tried to bury. A story of how serial paedophile coach Barry Bennell had started raping him at the age of 9.
I didn't know what was going on, to be fair. I knew where I wanted to get, and I thought, this is obviously what I've got to go through.
Did you know it was wrong? What he was doing was wrong?
I knew it was wrong, but I just went with it. Just went with it.
Barry Bennell has been jailed 3 times for child sexual abuse. He described himself as a monster in court papers in 2015. But speaking to the BBC in 1991, he was a picture of professionalism.
We really work the kids up, they're learning all the time. And we do a lot of talking to, as well as showing them the skills and explaining the game to them. But we explain that there's more to it than just coming here 1 hour a week.
He's permanently suspended from football. Yesterday, police removed a dog and property from his house in Milton Keynes. It's been a tough week for English football since Andy Woodward waived his anonymity to reveal the abuse he suffered at the hands of Bennell. Now 6 other players have come forward to allege abuse, including an unnamed player in today's Guardian newspaper who claims he was abused by convicted paedophile youth coach George Ormond while he was at Newcastle United. It shows the story is potentially spreading wider than just one coach, wider than just the North East. Indeed, for Jason Dunford, another of the players to have suffered abuse at the hands of Bennell, this feels like the tip of the iceberg.
Is this as big as Savile?
I think Savile looks like a choir boy compared to this fella and what's going on right now. Let me tell you.
Former England defender Danny Murphy began his career at Crewe Alexandra and was coached by Bennell. He once stayed at his house but was never abused by him. He recognises a common theme with the survivors' stories, though, how dreams and aspirations could be used as bait for horrific crimes.
And that particular guy is the person that can make it happen or not, in your head. And for some of the lads, I think Barry was that person. You know, if I don't toe the line, if I don't do what he says maybe, then maybe I'll be dropped, maybe I won't be footballer.
The obvious question now is, could football have done more?
Is it feasible that other adults at the time really didn't know what was happening?
Impossible. And there was people at those football clubs that had duty to look after the welfare of young boys coming through their system. This is their potential future stars. And their future stars are being sexually abused and sexually assaulted by a member of their staff.
Crewe Alexandra's director of football and former manager Dario Gradi released a statement yesterday saying no one at the club knew of Bennell's crimes until 1994 when he was arrested in America.
I was the same as every boy in this city. I had a dream of being a footballer, and every child who has a dream, to me, should be able to try and achieve that dream without having to go through sexual abuse or being around sexual predators.
For the man whose story started this, Andy Woodward, some sense of relief.
Last week I was on here, I was on my own, and I was so scared, but I knew that they were here. I've got, honest to God, Victoria, I can't thank the public enough and the media, and more importantly, the lads for backing me up, you know. I'm just totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
One man's heartbreak, leading others to finally feel able to share their torment.
Well, Natalie joins me now. Natalie, some very emotional testimony there, quite harrowing. These are historical accusations, but parents now will be concerned. What sort of safeguards are there?
Of course, and as parents, you want to know that when you take your children to football, they're going to be safe. And in 2001, the FA actually brought in new rules to protect children. It said that every club must have a trained welfare officer. But the onus, really, and the critics of this system, is that the onus is on children to report abuse, whereas in other countries, they have something called mandatory reporting, which makes it a crime, a criminal offence, not to report neglect or suspected neglect. The worry is that in the cases we've seen here, is that people can slip through the net, and football obviously failed in its duty of care to these people. Now, yesterday, the NSPCC, in conjunction with the FA, set up a hotline. By last night, they'd had more than 100 calls. We heard references there to the Savile case. The worry now, of course, is just how far does this go? Greg Clark, the FA chairman, had quite an emotional meeting with Andy Woodward, we saw there at Wembley yesterday. He also wrote to all club secretaries in the country, reminding them of diligence and how we have to look after young children. But Andy Woodward said to me yesterday, Natalie, you have no idea how big this is. And the worry, of course, now is it could be hundreds more footballers sharing similar harrowing stories.
Natalie, thank you. And you can see an extended version of the Victoria Derbyshire interview on the BBC News channel, and that's at 8:30 this evening. The serial killer Stephen Port has been told he should die in prison after being found guilty of 4 counts of murder, 4 rapes and 4 sexual assaults. The 41-year-old chef stalked his victims on dating websites and plied them with drinks spiked with fatal amounts of a date rape drug. Police were slow to make the link between the deaths, and 17 officers are now being investigated by the police watchdog. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Samford is at the Old Bailey for us now. Daniel.
Yes, after a trial that lasted almost 8 weeks came the moment of justice. The moment when the serial killer Stephen Port was told that he would never leave prison. Mr. Justice Openshaw told him he was a highly dangerous man who had told wicked and monstrous lies to cover up his killings. The families of Stephen Port's dead victims came to court today to learn his fate. In letters, they described to the judge how their worlds had been turned upside down and how they'd been broken by grief.
We finally have justice for our Jack and the other boys. That sick, twisted scumbag will never be able to hurt or destroy anyone else's family or life. Our Jack can finally rest in peace. We will always be completely heartbroken as a family.
These, the 4 young men, all doing well as they started out on adult life before being murdered by Port, all killed in just 15 months. Port listened from the dock as Mr. Justice Openshaw told him he was passing a whole life sentence, that he would die in jail. There were cheers from his victims' relatives. Stephen Port is one of the worst serial killers of recent years. His fetish was young gay men who he lured back to his bedroom using dating apps like Grindr, and then drugged them with GHB, rendering them unconscious to have sex with them, and he simply didn't care if they died.
Not once has he shown any remorse for his actions, for the deaths of 4 young men and the sexual assault of his other victims.
His former neighbour described to me how he went round one day as Port descended into a vortex of drug taking.
He took me through to the kitchen area, and on the coffee table was a massive clear container of drugs. There were lots and lots of vials of clear liquid, and there were lots and lots of clear bags with white powder in. And I was intensely uncomfortable at that point.
Stephen Port, who dumped 3 of his victims' bodies at this churchyard, will now die in jail. However, this case will always be infamous not just for his crimes, but also for the failure of the local detectives to even realise that there was a serial killer in their borough.
And Daniel, what response has there been from the police to this sentence?
Well, the police were, of course, delighted with the sentence. That's what they were hoping for. And the families of the people that Stephen Port killed were today full of praise for the team of detectives that had caught Stephen Port and finally brought him to this successful prosecution. But now, of course, begins the investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission into the police failings over the 15 months before, when a team of detectives in the borough where Stephen Port lived just simply didn't realise that there was a serial killer in their midst. It's worth remembering that the first time that they knew anybody had died was when the first man died, Anthony Walgate, and Stephen Port called them and reported that he was dead. And then as the bodies piled up essentially in the churchyard down the road, they refused to listen to people who were saying that something was wrong, that there was a problem, and they went on not linking the deaths, and that's how we ended up with 4 dead men instead of perhaps only 1. Rita.
Daniel, thank you. Daniel Sanford there. Business investment grew in the 3 months after the vote to leave the EU in June. It rose nearly 1% to £44.2 billion compared with the previous quarter. The Office for National Statistics says the services sector grew strongly, although manufacturing, agriculture and construction contracted. The Prime Minister of Malta has told the BBC that there's doubt across the European Union that Britain will be able to start formal Brexit negotiations by the end of March, as intended. Joseph Muscat, whose country takes on the EU's rotating presidency in January, said that even if Britain did reach an exit deal, it could be blocked by the European Parliament. He was speaking to our Europe editor, Katya Adler.
The British Foreign Minister Boris Johnson says we could, in theory, stay inside the single market, but also stop the freedom of movement. So just stop this idea that any EU citizen can come, move, live and work in the UK.
I could, in theory, win the 100 meters Olympic race. It's just not happening. No, I think all of us have been pretty clear in our approach that we want a fair deal for the UK, but that sort of fair deal cannot translate itself into a superior deal. I know that there is absolutely no bluffing from the European side, at least in the council meetings I have attended, in saying we will start with this position, then we will soften up. No, this is really and truly our position, and I don't see it changing.
Does it seem like a mess to you in the UK?
To me, it's hard to believe that, as someone who has studied in the United Kingdom, and to believe that the British civil service doesn't have this all sorted out.
What's the impression of the government in general? I mean, one has a sense as an observer that attitudes are hardening.
In the UK, it's fair game to bash Brussels, and then you don't need to be surprised if in Brussels they bash you back. So this is a bit of a catch-22. It won't be a situation where one side gains and the other side loses. We are all going to lose something. But I don't see, and there will not be a situation where the UK will have a better deal than it has today. It simply cannot be. But it will get complicated. Divorces are never easy, I think.
The Prime Minister of Malta there speaking to Katya Adler. Well, let's talk to Tom Bateman, our political correspondent in Westminster. And Tom, these are comments that Number 10 could presumably have done without.
Well, absolutely not. But amid all that talk of being bashed back by Brussels, I think it's comments and a message in particular that Downing Street can expect to hear more and more as the months go by. Because what Mr Muscat is saying here and what we're going to hear from other EU leaders is that they are preparing to play hardball when it comes to these negotiations. Now, we've had a response from Downing Street this morning. They say that the timetable remains on track. They intend to hit that EU exit button, trigger the Article 50 process by the end of March, and they want to get the best deal for British firms. So what does that mean? Well, of course, it brings us to that core issue about, as some see it, can you keep the goodies of staying part of the single market with also having a process by which Britain doesn't want to have to accept free movement. Now, what EU leaders like Mr Muscat are saying is absolutely not. You can't have one without the other. What Downing Street wants, of course, and what ministers are talking about is a bespoke deal that perhaps we could come out of the single market, keep elements of it without free movement. I think if you feel like you've heard some of this before. You can expect it to go on. It's going to be a long road until March, and this kind of phony war will continue.
Thanks very much, Tom. Tom Bateman there. The time is 16 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. Several more former footballers speak of their anguish after being sexually abused as children by a coach. And still to come, it's Black Friday. £2 billion worth of sales are expected to be racked up today.
Coming up in sport at past, can Lewis Hamilton retain his Formula One world title? He must outscore his Mercedes teammate and title rival Nico Rosberg by 13 points if he's to stop the German becoming world champion.
Well, as you just heard, UK shoppers are expected to spend a record £2 billion in Black Friday sales this year. Retailers predict that more than 3/4 of spending will take place online. That's up 16% on 2015. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson reports.
Would you queue in the moonlight for a Black Friday deal? Here in Trafford, the few that did knew exactly what they wanted.
Yes, I got a lovely TV. I'm very happy.
The Blah Punk was £2.50 yesterday, and so got both really for the price of one.
It's not just a one-day phenomenon anymore. Many retailers have been rolling out Black Friday deals for more than a week.
Are you going to make money out of this?
This might not be the most profitable event for us over the course of a year, but what we know is that customers love especially to treat themselves. About 60% of all purchases are going to be bought by people for themselves, and therefore it's a really powerful event for us to run.
Well, there have been no fights over cut-price TVs here. This store's been open just over an hour and it's already incredibly quiet. Just like last year, millions of us are shopping online.
Like Erin in Watford, bagging a breakfast bargain before she heads off to college.
It's much easier just to sit down with your laptop rather than having to get up and go out. I feel lazy.
She's not the only one. Here at Argos, they're flat out processing a surge in online orders.
Between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock this morning, we had over 500,000 visits to our website, which is up 50% year on year. So really encouraging start to what will be our biggest day ever.
Consumers aren't holding back. We could be spending even more than last year. But as Argos is going at full throttle, there are some retailers like this one which aren't taking part.
We like to create beautiful products that people enjoy. We like everyone to have an amazing Christmas. And this idea that it gets commoditised by discount, the idea that it's not really worth what it was in the first place, the idea that the customer's trying to work out if something they bought last week is at the right price or the wrong price, it just devalues everything.
Love it or hate it, in just a few years, Black Friday has changed the way we shop in the run-up to Christmas, spending earlier and doing less heavy lifting in stores. Emma Simpson, BBC News, Trafford.
Scotland Yard has said it'll change its response to child protection cases after a scathing report into its handling of child abuse and sexual exploitation. The Inspectorate of Constabulary criticised the handling of 3/4 of the cases it examined and said there was an indefensible lack of leadership on the issue with no single officer in charge. Richard Slee reports.
This report contains some of the most scathing criticism ever for a police force from its watchdog. It found that nearly 3/4 of the 374 cases it examined were inadequately handled. There were unacceptable delays in obtaining evidence, and a failure to take some cases of missing children seriously, with local officers often unaware of registered sex offenders living in their area. Inspectors also referred 38 of the cases they examined back to the force, because of concerns there could be a continuing risk to children.
What we don't have evidence for, because we weren't looking for, is any specific crimes or damage to children that happened as a result of these failings. What we can say with confidence is that children were kept at risk, at higher risk, for longer than they should have been, and were put in more danger than they should have been.
The Metropolitan Police has apologised for its failings and says it's already identified a number of areas that need improvement.
This report says some really
challenging things to us about investigations that we have not done as well as we could have done. And we need to look at that, and we need to learn from that, and we need to use this to build on the work that we're already doing to try and make our services as protective as we can for children.
This is the third time, though, in as many weeks that the competence and judgment of Met officers have been called into question. There were failings identified in Operation Midland, the inquiry into an alleged high-level paedophile ring. The Met will be inspected again next year to see if it's succeeding in providing better protection for children in London. Richard Slee, BBC News.
A nurse accused of giving a false temperature reading of her Ebola-infected colleague Pauline Cafferkey has been suspended for 2 months. A disciplinary panel had already found that Donna Wood, a senior nurse, dishonestly suggested that Miss Cafferkey's temperature was lower than it was during an airport screening after they returned from Sierra Leone. Miss Cafferkey became ill with Ebola shortly afterwards. Well, Robert Piggott is in East London for us now. Robert.
Yes, the disciplinary panel said that Donna Wood's dishonesty had been serious but not premeditated. It said that she had breached the fundamental tenets of her profession and exposed Pauline Cafferkey to harm. But it said in deciding to suspend rather than strike her off, it had taken account of her hitherto unblemished 30-year career and her selfless act of courage in going to Africa to fight Ebola. Donna Wood, who was at the Nursing and Midwifery Council to hear the sanctions against her, was among the first British volunteers in the fight against Ebola. She became the face of the campaign to recruit more medics to contain the disease. The then International Development Secretary, Justine Greening, described her as a heroine. But after 6 weeks, risking her life in a treatment centre in Sierra Leone, Donna Wood exposed her own country to the risk of Ebola. Mrs Wood and Pauline Cafferkey, seen here at Heathrow Airport on their departure for Sierra Leone, were together at a screening centre at the airport on their return in December 2014. A doctor in their party took Ms Cafferkey's temperature and told Mrs Wood it was over 38 degrees, easily enough to trigger an investigation into the presence of Ebola. But Mrs Wood suggested it be recorded 1 degree lower, adding, "Let's get out of here and sort it out later." Earlier, during her training, Mrs Wood had spoken of the need to minimise risk by following procedure.
I think you have to have a sense of trepidation. You know, you wouldn't be human if you didn't have that. And that obviously what makes you thinking about what you're doing and making sure that you're taking time to do things and get the procedures correct.
A doctor who served with Mrs Wood in Sierra Leone and was at Heathrow at the same time claims she's getting the blame for the failures of an overcrowded and chaotic screening centre.
The fact that we had to take each other's temperatures, that should simply have not happened. We should have been looked after basically by Public Health England. And, I can't help but think that part of what's happened subsequently is just scapegoating.
Public Health England, who managed the screening centre, said we entirely reject the suggestion that screening was disorganised. It was busy at Heathrow, but simply wrong to allege that it was chaotic. We screened thousands of returners from countries most at risk of Ebola and did so with efficiency and courtesy throughout. Whatever the circumstances of the screening, Ebola got into Britain. And, the panel said, it was only by good fortune that Pauline Cafferkey did not expose the public to a high risk of infection. This was indeed the story of what might have been. From any moment that Pauline Cafferkey left Heathrow, she could have become highly infectious at any time. Ebola got into Britain, and it wasn't through a tourist wandering in perhaps via a third country, but among a group of medical experts, people who knew most, including Donna Wood, about the terrible disease of Ebola and the danger it posed. Rita.
Thank you, Robert. On average, 3 babies in England are born every day addicted to drugs because of their mother's dependency during pregnancy, according to new NHS figures. Those babies will often be taken from their mothers and given to family members or to social services. But some experts believe that rehabilitating the parent with the child is more successful. Our reporter Frankie McCamley gained access to the only centre in the UK offering this service.
So nice.
Louise was addicted to heroin for 13 years. It meant her son was born addicted to drugs, but living here means she can keep him with her. She's taking methadone to try to break her habit.
Yes, wash time.
This is the only rehab centre left in the country just for mothers and their children. Without it, the children would probably be taken into care.
To have him still with me is amazing, to be quite honest, because they tried to take him straight from birth.
Do you think you could do this without him?
No.
New figures showed that in England, on average, 3 babies every day are born addicted to drugs. But this programme is expensive, costing nearly £40,000 for 6 months, and only 2/3 of residents complete it.
When you look at the bigger picture, this is a really cost-effective way of working with families, because if you spend the money now in helping families, in helping them to recover, it's money saved elsewhere in the system.
Around 20 women every year enter these gates. They'll have to follow a regimented plan. The hope is that they'll leave here with their children to start their new life, drug and alcohol free.
That's a tractor.
Emma was a heroin addict. She went through the programme here and has been able to keep her twins.
It's actually heartbreaking that so many people like me are just written off. Oh, well, you're a drug addict, so you can't have your child. You know, something has got to change. The people, the women that I have met in this place are phenomenal.
For some, though, it doesn't work.
I love you.
Katie only has her son for day visits because she relapsed after leaving.
This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me, being separated from my son, because it's like my heart has been ripped out. It's just a horrible, horrible feeling that like you're at this terrible mum.
A tissue! A tissue!
Treatment here is expensive and some will question whether it's money well spent. As for Louise, she'll find out soon whether she can keep her child.
Are we ready?
Frankie McCamley, BBC News, Plymouth.
Britain's Formula One champion Lewis Hamilton will try to retain his title in Abu Dhabi this weekend, but it'll be no easy task. His Mercedes teammate Nico Rosberg is ahead by 12 points with only 1 race to go. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss looks at Hamilton's chances.
Striding into the spotlight, Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg arriving for the so-called duel in the desert. Hamilton was quickest in this morning's practice session, but after a season blighted by mechanical problems, it's his opponent who's in the driving seat. Rosberg needs only to finish 3rd to clinch the title. The pair, rivals since childhood, now racing for the ultimate prize.
The great thing is, I faced adversity this year and I fought it, and I'm still, last race, still just about within a title shot. So I'm going to give it everything I've got on Sunday.
So could this season yet have a final twist? The two title rivals do have one big thing in common. They both drive one of these, a Mercedes. Hamilton and Rosberg are teammates, remember? Not that this season you'd have guessed it. They've already had 2 collisions this season, and with so much at stake, their team boss told me another wasn't impossible.
If they go through the first corner wheel by wheel, it's their business, it's their responsibility. I'm very confident in their abilities as racing drivers, but we also acknowledge the rivalry and the heat of the moment, and in a racing car, things happen.
Jackie Stewart was the favourite.
And should Hamilton clinch the championship, he'd overtake this man and become the first British driver to win 4 world titles. A case of when, Sir Jackie Stewart believes, rather than if.
Records are made to be broken, and if it's not this year, it'll be another year. He'll win the World Championship again and again because of his natural ability.
For another British star, it is farewell this weekend. Jenson Button racing in his last Grand Prix. But Hamilton will be aiming to make the headlines. He is still getting to grips with the circuit, but he'll be hoping that practice will make perfect. Andy Swiss, BBC News.